It was not the dying that stayed with me longest. It was the watching. For 9 days, something stood at the edge of my property and refused to leave. Something that had no reason to be there, no language to explain its presence, and no capacity, by any account I had ever been given about the natural world, to grieve. And yet there it was. Every morning when the gray light came through the frost-thick windows, I could see it from the bed where I lay with my bad back and my coffee going cold on the nightstand. Standing at the tree line, still as carved wood, watching the house, watching me. I am 67 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades alone in these hills, and I have learned to read stillness the way other men read faces, and what I saw in those 9 mornings was not the stillness of waiting, or of predation, or of territorial claim. It was the stillness of vigil, and I knew it the way I knew it when I sat with my father in his last weeks, the way I knew it when I sat with men in the field who were not going to make it to morning. You do not need a word for something you have felt before. You recognize it in the body before the mind catches up. I am telling you this now because my chest does not feel right, and my doctor uses the word manageable in a tone that suggests the opposite. I have been manageable myself for 30 years, and I know what that word costs the person saying it. I want someone to know what really happened on this farm. I want it recorded somewhere that is not just my own memory, because my own memory is the one container I can no longer trust to last. So, I am telling you all of it from the very beginning, and I am asking you to stay with me through the long parts, because the long parts are what made the 9 days mean what they meant. You cannot understand what Samuel did at the end without understanding what the years before it built between us. You cannot understand what Goliath was without understanding what Goliath had always been. And you cannot understand any of it without starting where it actually started, which was a feather on a back door in the fall of 2011. The feather was the first thing. That is where this story truly begins, though I did not understand it at the time. A single, large feather, dark as a bruise along the spine and light at the edges where the barbs had worn soft with age or use. I found it pressed against the back door of the farmhouse the morning after I first heard the sound from the north tree line. Not laid there by wind, pressed flat and deliberate against the wood, parallel to the ground, as though positioned by something that understood how placement communicated intention. I turned it over in my hands for a minute, looking at the size of it, which was longer than my forearm, and I set it on the kitchen windowsill and went about my morning, and told myself it was a turkey feather from a large bird, and that it had blown against the door in the night. I did not believe that, but I told myself it anyway and left it at that. That was the fall of 2011. I was 52 years old, barely 3 months on this property in the hill country of western Tennessee, and I had no idea what was watching me from the tree line each night when the dark settled into the hollows. I had no idea that feather would come back to me twice more before the end, and I had no idea that by the time it did, everything I thought I understood about isolation and witness and what it means to simply stay beside something would have been dismantled and rebuilt from different materials entirely. My name is Robert Bowman. I came to this land the way broken men often come to remote places, not running towards something but running away from the accumulated weight of everything that had not worked out. 22 years in the Army left me with a back that predicted rain better than any forecaster, and a set of memories I had no safe place to store. The Army gives you a framework for everything, and then one day it stops giving you frameworks, and you are standing in a parking lot somewhere in your civilian clothes with a pension and a backpack full of habits that do not translate cleanly into the world where people go to the grocery store and argue about lawn boundaries. My marriage did not end in a fight. That would have been easier. It ended the way certain military operations end quietly, administratively, with paperwork and signatures and a mutual agreement not to assign blame in public while privately assigning it everywhere. My ex-wife was not a bad person. I was not a bad person. We were two people who had tried to build a life in the spaces between my absences and had discovered, slowly and then all at once, that spaces between absences were not the same thing as presence. We had no children, which was a grief I carried quietly and which I do not have the room to explain fully here, except to say that it shaped the particular quality of my loneliness in ways I am still working out. I had a settlement and a severance, and enough put away to buy 43 acres in a county where the nearest neighbor was a 20-minute drive on a dirt road that turned to clay in the wet months and made the 20 minutes feel like an hour. I wanted silence. I wanted enough land to walk in without reaching an edge. I wanted to stop being someone who had to account for himself to anyone at any hour. I got all of those things. I also got something else entirely, and it arrived before I was ready for it. And it changed the fundamental texture of the years that followed in ways I did not know how to measure, until I was standing in a frozen yard in December of 2021, watching something I could not name grieve beside something it had loved, and I understood then that the something else I had gotten when I bought this farm was the most important thing that had ever happened to me. The farm itself was a working property when I bought it, though barely. The previous owner, a man named Krellin, who had moved to Florida to live with his daughter, had kept a small cattle operation on the lower fields and a hay contract that barely paid its own diesel costs. I did not want cattle. I did not want contracts. I planted the lower fields back to pasture grass in the first spring. Let the perimeter fencing go to productive rust in the places where it would not hold deer, and repaired it only where it mattered structurally. And I spent that first year primarily learning the land rather than trying to extract something from it. I walked every acre, which took most of the good mornings for months. I mapped the creek beds, both of them, the main one that ran along the south boundary and the tributary that came down from the north ridge and met it at the eastern corner of the property. I found the hollow on the north side where cold air pooled on still nights, sitting 4 degrees below the temperature at the ridgeline above it, and I found the shelf of limestone that broke through the hillside behind the equipment shed and provided a natural windbreak along the northwest exposure. I learned which trees held owls and which held crows, and what the difference in the morning noise they made meant about the weather coming in. I was methodical about all of this because methodical was the only way I knew how to be. In the Army, you learn with your body that an environment you have not studied will eventually kill you. Out here in the civilian hills, I found that the same principle held, though the stakes moved slower, and the killing was of a quieter kind. The sounds began in October of that first year. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed the pattern within 2 weeks, and began keeping a loose record of the dates and approximate times in the back of a small notebook I kept in the kitchen. Coming from the north tree line, always from the north tree line, past the old equipment shed and somewhere in the black gap between the last fence post and the first true forest, where the pines got dense enough that the dark under them was absolute, a sound I can describe only as being too low in register to be a person, and too rhythmic and deliberate to be an animal. Not a howl, which has a shape and a peak and a trailing off. Not a grunt, which is percussive and brief. Something between a moan and a word, formed in the throat and released slowly, as though whatever was making it was not entirely certain whether it wanted to be heard. Some nights it came twice, some nights once and then nothing. I am not a man who startles easily, and I am not a man given to reading threat into unfamiliar things. But I went out the first 3 nights with a flashlight and a rifle, and found nothing visible, and I found tracks in the wet ground near the shed that I could not classify with certainty, wide prints, Heavy, the impression deep enough to suggest significant mass. The stride was wrong for a bear. Too long between prints, and the toe configuration suggested a different distribution of weight, something that moved its mass differently than any four-legged animal I had studied. I photographed the prints with a disposable camera I found in the junk drawer. When I brought the developed prints back from the drugstore in town, the young woman at the counter looked at them for a long moment, holding the strip of photos at arm's length, and then handed them back without a word and rang up my other items and did not make eye contact again. I told myself it was probably a large dog gone feral, maybe a cross between something domestic and something that had been running in these hills for generations without human contact. I told myself the tracks were distorted by the soft ground and that my measurements, which I had done with a pocket tape, had been imprecise. I told myself a great many things that Autumn and I believed almost none of them, and I kept believing them anyway because the alternative required a framework I was not yet prepared to construct. I had spent 22 years in an institution that prized certainty of classification above almost everything else. You identified the threat and you named it, and you responded to it with a named response. The thing in the north tree line did not fit any named category, and that gap between what I was experiencing and what I had language for created a kind of low-grade cognitive friction that I managed by choosing the most available explanation and applying it consistently even when the evidence argued otherwise. That is the thing about this kind of knowing. It does not arrive cleanly. It seeps in at the edges over months and years until one morning you wake up and the seepage has become the foundation of what you stand on, and there is no pretending otherwise, and you realize the pretending was never actually about disbelief. It was about buying yourself enough time to be ready. The winter of 2011 came in hard and early, snow on the ground before Thanksgiving, which everyone in the county agreed was unusual, and temperatures that dropped below freezing in mid-November and stayed there through January with only brief interruptions. I kept a wood stove in the main room and a smaller one in the bedroom, and I cut and split my own wood because the physical labor of it was the closest thing I had found to the meditative state that other people seem to access through sitting still, which I had never managed. On the morning of December 9th, I went out before sunrise to bring in the morning wood from the covered stack beside the equipment shed, and I found the second sign. Not a feather this time. A deer haunch, the whole rear quarter from the hip joint down, freshly separated and laid on the flat stone of the back step with the fur turned carefully outward. Clean work at the joint. No ragged tearing, no gnaw marks, no sign of the frantic consumption that any natural predator would leave. Whatever had separated that joint from the rest of the carcass had done it with a precision and deliberateness that no wild animal achieves by accident. It had been placed, oriented. I stood over it in the dark with my breath making small clouds in the air, and the flashlight making shadows of the hairs on the fur. And I thought carefully about what I had been telling myself for 2 months. Then I went inside and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and watched the window lighten from black to gray to the thin white of a December morning in Tennessee hill country. And I sat with what I knew, and what I was willing to say I knew, until they arrived at the same place. By February of 2012, I had begun leaving things out on the back step. A can of sardines, pressed open and flat. A strip of the dried venison I had put up in the fall. Not as an offering in any ceremonial sense. More as an acknowledgement. A way of saying into the dark, I know you are there, and I'm not pretending otherwise, and I am willing to acknowledge that we are in some kind of communication that neither of us has the full vocabulary for yet. These things were always gone by morning. Always. The word always is one I do not use carelessly. I mean it in the absolute sense. Every single thing I left on that step was gone before the light came up. for months, without exception. And the absence of the exception is what told me this was not scavengers or raccoons, but something with a consistent and deliberate relationship to what I was doing. The first real sighting came in March, the 9th of March, 2012, on a night with a full moon so bright it threw hard shadows across the snow, the kind of light that in the Army we called good hunting conditions, meaning good for us and bad for whatever we were hunting. I was awake at 2 in the morning for no reason I could identify, some old soldier's wiring that never fully unlearned the habit of checking the perimeter in the small hours. I carried my coffee to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and the equipment shed and the tree line beyond, all of it silver and black in the moon, and there it was, standing at the corner of the equipment shed in the open, not pressed into the shadow of the tree line or moving or crouching, standing upright in the full moonlight as though the decision to be seen had been made and was now being enacted without hesitation. 7 feet tall at an absolute minimum. The shoulders were wide in a way that the moonlight made difficult to fully measure, broad through the upper chest and upper arm in a way that corresponded to the kind of mass that changes how a thing moves. Covered in fur that was dark along the back and lighter at the chest, longer over the shoulders and upper back and shorter and more compressed at the forearms, which were long in a way that did not fit any proportional framework I had ever learned for either human or animal bodies. The face was partly in shadow from the overhang of the shed roof. The posture was upright in a way that was not exactly human and not exactly animal, but occupied some third category that I did not have a word for. It stood the way a very old and very tired person stands when they have stopped trying to appear stronger than they are, loose at the shoulders, weight distributed evenly across both feet. Watching the house with a patience that communicated nothing aggressive and nothing fearful and nothing uncertain. Simply watching. As though watching was the whole point, and it had been doing this long enough to be comfortable with its own patience. I did not raise the rifle. I want to be explicit about that because it is the single detail I have returned to more times than I can count over the years since. I had the rifle in my hands. I had picked it up from beside the bedroom door out of the reflex that 11 months of nighttime sounds in that tree line had installed in my nervous system, and I stood at the kitchen counter and I looked at that thing in the moonlight, and I set the rifle down against the cabinet, and I did not pick it up again. What I felt in that moment was not courage, and it was not foolishness. It was closer to the recognition you feel when you have been alone in a remote place for a long time, and one night there is a knock at the door, and in the moment before you open it, before you have any information at all about who is on the other side, you already know in your body that the knock is not a threat. It is just company. Unexpected, unexplainable, inconvenient company, company that will complicate things considerably, but company. That is what I felt. I set the rifle down and I raised my hand, palm out, slowly, the way you would raise it to a horse that does not know you yet, but is deciding whether to trust you. The figure at the shed corner did not move for a long moment. I counted my own breaths. Then it turned and walked back into the tree line with a stride that covered distance in a way I would spend years watching and never fully account for. Long and completely unhurried and silent, in a way that should not have been physically possible for something that size moving across frozen ground. I stood at the kitchen window until I was certain it was gone. Then I sat down at the table, and I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I went out in the early light and measured the tracks in the snow beside the shed. 6 feet between steps, measured from the front edge of one print to the front edge of the next. I stood in one of the prints with my own boot, a size 11, and my foot occupied roughly the center third of the impression. I went back inside and I sat with that measurement for a long time. Now, I should confess something here before I go further, and I recognize that what I am about to say will strike some of you as a strange interruption in the middle of something serious. My niece, who is the one who convinced me to record this and who set up the camera and the computer and whatever else is involved in this process, she told me several times that there is something I am supposed to say at some point about a button and a bell, and that the people who watch these things expect it, and that it matters in ways I do not entirely understand, but that apparently have to do with mathematics and the computer deciding whether to show this to more people. I do not understand the mathematics of it, and I am not going to pretend to. I will say only that I have no idea what a bell on a computer does, and I find the whole enterprise slightly baffling, but if you are the sort of person who pushes a button and rings a bell, and that is a thing that helps, then by all means go ahead and do that. My niece will be satisfied, and I can get back to what actually happened. I mention this only because I was told it needs to go somewhere in the middle, and this felt like the right valley for it, before things got heavier. They are about to get heavier. By the spring of 2012, the creature's presence had become, if not ordinary, then at least integrated into the rhythm of the farm in the way that a new and permanent feature of the landscape eventually integrates. Not familiar exactly, but no longer foreign. I had stopped going out with the rifle. I had stopped keeping the notebook of dates and times. I knew roughly when it would appear, late evening, as the last of the day's light left the western edge of the property. And I knew which section of the tree line it preferred, the north side near the equipment shed, which was the highest point of the property and gave the widest view of the yard and the lower fields. I knew it was curious about the work I did during the day because I could find the pressed flat evidence of its watching in the field grass along the tractor's path, a wide oval depression where something heavy had stood for a long period. I knew it did not like the chainsaw exhaust because on days I was cutting wood, the sightings moved to the far southeastern corner of the property, as far from the smell as the land allowed. I knew it was not a single creature until June of that year, when I saw them both together for the first time at the south end of the property near the creek crossing, and that understanding changed everything. I was walking the south fence line in the early evening, checking the posts after a week of ground-saturating rain, and I came to the creek crossing and stopped. They were standing in the water, both of them, thigh-deep in the running creek in the last amber light of a June evening, and for a moment the image was so fundamentally impossible in the context of everything I understood about the world that I simply stood and looked without processing it. Then the processing began. Two of them, both upright, both massive by any standard I had available. But the differences between them were immediate and unmistakable even from the 40 yards of distance I was standing at. The larger one had the heavy, deliberate stillness I had come to recognize from a year of watching it at the tree line. It stood in the water the way it stood everywhere, with the settled authority of something that has never had to question its own right to occupy space. The smaller one, and I use smaller loosely, because by any objective measure it was enormous, moved differently. The head was quicker at the turn, more responsive, more inclined to shift directly toward my presence rather than simply registering me in its peripheral awareness. It took a half step forward in the water when it registered me and then held, which was a quality I had never seen in the larger one. Curiosity expressed as physical inclination. The desire to close distance rather than simply maintain it. I named them because that is what you do when something becomes a sustained and meaningful part of your life, and you need a way to think about it clearly inside your own head. I named the larger one Goliath because the biblical resonance felt accurate rather than ironic. Large, heavy with power, defined by the weight of what it carried. Not villainous. The scripture never actually makes Goliath villainous. Just large, just formidable, just the way it is and unashamed of it. The smaller one I named Samuel. Not because Samuel in the scripture was small or inclined toward curiosity, though he was, but because Samuel was the one who heard his name called in the dark and answered it before he understood who was calling. That quality of being receptive to the address of the unknown felt like the truest thing I could find for what I was watching at the creek. Goliath watched the world. Samuel listened to it. Those were the fundamental differences, and those differences determined the shape of everything that followed across the years I am about to describe. The summer of 2012 was also the summer I understood that Samuel was the one who had been leaving things on my back step from the very beginning. The feather, the deer haunch, the positioned food items, all of it. I arrived at this conclusion not through any single dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of observational evidence over several months. The feather had been pressed at a height that corresponded to Samuel's reach rather than Goliath's. The food offerings were positioned with a precision and intentionality that matched Samuel's quality of doing things with deliberateness rather than force. And on a morning in late August, I watched through the kitchen window in the dark of 4 in the morning, completely still with my coffee cooling in my hands, and I saw Samuel come out of the tree line alone, cross the yard with that long and quiet stride, approach the back step, and set something on the flat stone. Then stand there and look at the kitchen window with a directness that was not aggressive and not uncertain, but communicative in the clearest sense I had experienced from another living thing in years. Then turn and go back toward the tree line without hurry. The thing Samuel had left was a creek stone, smooth and flat, rounded by the water of the south tributary over time I could not estimate. It fit inside my palm. I went out and picked it up and turned it over and felt the weight of it, which was heavier than it looked, and I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen windowsill beside the feather that had been there since October of the previous year. 2 objects, both left deliberately, both saying the same thing in a language that had no words but was entirely legible. The months that followed were the months of what I can only describe as the pure good of the arrangement. No complications had arrived yet, no fractures, no warnings. Just the daily life of a solitary man on a working farm, slowly incorporating the presence of 2 extraordinary creatures into its margins, in a way that changed the quality of the days without disrupting their structure. Goliath remained watchful and distant, maintaining the property's edge as territory, never approaching closer than 50 yards to the house, functioning as something between a guardian and an observer, keeping the kind of perimeter that made the farm feel contained and held in a way I had not anticipated needing. Samuel came closer as the months progressed. 30 yards by September, 20 by October. By November, when the trees had given up their leaves and the cover was gone from the yard's edges, I would see Samuel sitting at the yard's boundary in the early dark with the particular quality of stillness that large things have when they are resting rather than watching. The weight settled and the attention relaxed inward rather than outward. I began talking, not to anyone in particular, and not expecting any comprehension in the conventional sense, but in the way that people who have been alone for a sustained period begin to narrate their own experience aloud, simply because the alternative is a silence that eventually becomes its own kind of pressure. I would be working on the fence, and I would describe what I was doing and why. I told Samuel about the hydraulic problem with the tractor and how I had ordered the seal kit and why the repair was more involved than it looked. I mentioned, one evening in November, as the dark came down fast and cold, that it had been nearly 4 years since I had spoken to my ex-wife, and that I was not certain whether the feeling I had about that gap was grief or relief or something else that did not have a clean name. Samuel sat at the yard's edge and received all of this without any response I could reliably interpret. And that reception without judgment was worth more to me than I had the framework to acknowledge at the time. The winters were the deep times. The first real winter with the full knowledge of both of them, the winter of 2012 into 2013, was also the winter I understood the arrangement most clearly. The snow simplified everything. It reduced the world to what was immediate and essential, and it made the evidence of presence legible in a way that the other seasons did not. I could see where they had traveled in the night by reading the morning's snow. I learned that Goliath and Samuel sheltered somewhere on the north side of the property, where the ridgeline broke the prevailing wind and the pines grew dense enough to hold heat. In a hollow or a natural formation I tried several times to locate and never did. The tracks always went into the north woods, and I always stopped following them at the property boundary, not out of any formal decision but out of the sense that some spaces are not meant to be visited. They exist. You know they exist. That is the right amount of knowing. I kept the food on the back step through the whole of the winter, not because I believed they depended on it, but because the practice was the point. It was the daily material acknowledgement of the arrangement. I am here. You are there. We are both aware of it, and neither of us is pretending otherwise. The creek stone and the feather stayed on the windowsill through that winter, and the next, and all the winters that followed. Some mornings I would look at both of them, while the coffee was percolating, and feel something that I could not name then, and still cannot name now with any precision. The closest available word is gratitude, but that is not quite it. Gratitude implies a benefactor and a recipient, and a clearly understood exchange, and what I felt was less transactional than that. More like the feeling you get standing in a landscape that has no particular obligation to be beautiful, but is anyway a feeling that something unasked for has been placed in your life, and that the correct response is not analysis, but attention. By the winter of 2014, I was 55 years old, and the land had become mine in the way that land becomes yours only through the sustained application of attention and work and loss. I had rebuilt the equipment shed from the roof down after a bad ice storm took out the east wall. I had refenced the north field with new cedar posts and welded wire. I had cleared the logjam in the South Creek that had been flooding the lower pasture every spring without exception since before I arrived. A 3-day project involving a chainsaw and a come-along and a quantity of profanity. I had planted a small orchard on the south-facing slope, 12 apple trees and 4 pear trees from bare root stock. In rows I had measured and staked myself, and the oldest of the apple trees had given a modest first harvest that fall, maybe 40 pounds of fruit, which I had cooked down into sauce and put up in jars that lined the back of the kitchen shelf like a small accomplishment made visible. The farm was not profitable in any sense that would have satisfied an accountant, but it was orderly. And orderly was its own kind of return for a man who had spent most of his adult life in environments where order was imposed from outside and was always provisional. I slept better than I had in 30 years. My back still predicted rain. But the memories without names, the ones stored in the place that had no address, those had quieted in a way I had not expected and could not fully explain. I suspect the land was part of it. I suspect Goliath and Samuel in the dark at the property's edge were part of it. The two things had woven themselves together in a way that made separate accounting difficult. There was one incident in the spring of 2015 that I need to tell you because it belongs to the full picture. A boy named Harlan, 16 years old and the nephew of the family, 2 properties to the east, came onto my north tree line on a Saturday morning in April with a rifle and a school friend of similar age and an idea about what might be living in the hills above my farm. Children talk. Adults talk more carefully, but talk nonetheless. I had been as careful as a man can be while still living his actual life, but careful has limits in a county where people pay attention to unusual things. Someone had seen a shape at the tree line from a road above, had described it over dinner somewhere, and it had traveled through the community in that quiet and thorough way that unusual things always travel in small communities. I knew they were coming before, They knew I knew because Samuel came to the yard in full daylight that morning, well before noon, which had never happened before, and stood at the yard's edge looking not at me, but in the direction of the north fence line with an attention that was completely different from Samuel's usual quality of being present. This was directed attention. Pointed attention. The kind that in a person you would call warning. I looked where Samuel was looking. Then I got in my truck and drove the long way around to the north fence line, and I found the two boys before they had covered 200 yards into the tree line, and I spoke to them in the language of absolute clarity that the Army teaches you, and that remains effective in civilian contexts when deployed with full conviction. They did not come back. Samuel was gone from the yard when I returned, but that evening at dusk, Goliath came to the equipment shed, the closest I had ever seen Goliath come to the house, and stood there in the last light of an April evening with a quality I can only call acknowledgement. I had done a thing that needed doing, and Goliath was standing in the last light saying so. The years from 2015 to 2019 were years of accumulation that I do not have the space to fully document here, but whose texture I need you to feel. Every season brought its small additions to what existed between us. Samuel learned the farm as an inhabitant learns a place, not as a visitor cataloging features, but as someone with a stake in what happens there. I knew which fence post Samuel had touched because the wood showed a specific pattern of wear at a particular height that was not weather damage. I knew Samuel had been in the orchard during the apple harvest because the fallen fruit was arranged in piles near the trunk of the largest tree in a configuration that no wind or gravity produces on its own. I knew that on nights when the coyote pack was active and vocal to the south, Samuel moved closer to the house, and the coyotes, reliable and vocal every other night, did not cross the South Creek on those nights. Not once. I knew the texture of Samuel's moods across the seasons, the more expansive quality of the summer evenings, the contracted and inward quality of the deep winter nights. I knew the particular way Samuel's head turned when something in the far woods was being assessed, and the different turn when something in the near yard was being considered. These are the kinds of knowings that accumulate without announcement, until the day you realize that the shape of your life has been fundamentally altered by their presence, and that you would not trade them for anything the ordinary world might offer as an alternative. In the fall of 2019, I was 61 years old, and my heart introduced itself to my attention in a way that could not be managed by ignoring it. A pressure in the chest that began as something I classified as musculoskeletal and reclassified over 2 weeks as something else. The doctor in the county seat used the word significant. The cardiologist in Nashville used the word intervention. I used the word no for longer than was medically advisable before arriving at the word surgery. 6 weeks in a hospital and a rehabilitation facility before I came back to the farm in January of 2020, thinner than I had left and slower, and in possession of a set of instructions about exertion and diet and rest that I intended to follow and largely did. The night I came back, I sat in the kitchen and looked at the windowsill. The creekstone was there, the feather was there. Nothing in the house had moved or been touched in 6 weeks. I looked out into the dark yard, and I said out loud, to no one and to whatever was out there, I am back. Within 2 days, Samuel was at the yard's edge at dusk. I went out in the cold January air, and we looked at each other across 20 yards of dead grass, and that was the reunion, and it was more than sufficient. The spring of 2020 was when I could no longer avoid naming what was happening to Goliath. I had noticed it earlier, something shifting in the quality of the long-distance watching, a change from the active and deliberate perimeter keeping of the early years to something with a more settled and less intentional quality. By spring, it was impossible to characterize as anything other than what it was. The gait had changed. The weight distribution was different. the mass sitting lower and less evenly balanced than it once had, the stride slightly shorter, and the recovery between steps slightly longer. Goliath was eating less, which I could track by what remained on the back step in the mornings. The ranging had reduced. The full property perimeter that had been a consistent feature of Goliath's movements now contracted to a smaller and smaller circuit around the north tree line and the equipment shed. I had seen this progression in old soldiers, men whose bodies began to express what their minds and wills refused to acknowledge. I had seen it in my father in his last years. I knew what it was. I was not ready to say it. Samuel changed accordingly. The approaches to the yard became more frequent. A second dark stone appeared on the back step one morning in late autumn of 2020, larger than the creek stone and darker, with a marking along one face that I spent a long time looking at without conclusion. I moved both stones to the windowsill, where they sat beside the feather in a row. I looked at that row of objects some mornings, and felt the approach of something I did not want to approach. But the approach was not optional, it was already underway. By the summer of 2021, the understanding was complete. Goliath was dying. The process was months advanced, and I understood it in my body before I could say it in language, the same way you understand that a fire is going out long before the last ember dies, by the quality of the heat and the quality of the light, and the particular silence that begins to grow at the edges of it. Samuel did not leave Goliath's side. Whatever the separate territories and separate rhythms of the earlier years had been, those were over. Every evening at the tree line, there were two silhouettes where before there had sometimes been one, and the relationship between them had shifted completely. Samuel, no longer the curious and approaching one, the one who crossed to the yard and left things on the step, but the one who maintained close and constant contact with the heavier and slower figure beside it. There was nothing ambiguous in that posture. I did not need any framework beyond what I already knew from my own experience of watching people leave. The fourth week of December 2021 arrived with a cold that had a kind of focused intent behind it. Below 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 consecutive days, a wind from the northwest that came through the ridgeline without any interruption, the kind of cold that makes the old wood of a farmhouse settle and groan at night as it contracts around what it is being asked to hold. On the evening of December 22nd, Samuel brought Goliath to the yard. Not to the tree line, not to the field edge, to the yard itself, within 15 yards of the back door of the house, which in all the years I had known them had never happened with Goliath. They came across the yard slowly, Samuel's shoulder serving as both guide and partial support, and they stopped at the near edge of the yard and stood in what was left of the light of a day that had been gray from its beginning. I watched from the kitchen window without moving. Goliath looked at the house for a long time, with an expression I cannot reduce to any word I have available except to say that it contained everything. The whole weight of years, and presence and proximity, and whatever it is that one living thing accumulates toward another living thing when they have shared the same ground for a long time. Then they turned and went back to the tree line together. I did not sleep that night. On the morning of December 23rd, I was up at 4, building the fire in the main room, larger than I needed it, and sitting with my coffee in the chair by the window. When the light came up, I went to the kitchen and looked out, and Goliath was at the back step. Alone. Lying down, which I had never seen in 10 years of watching. Not lying in a resting posture, not the position of a body that has chosen the ground for comfort. The position of a body that has been brought to the ground by something larger than its own intention. I put on my coat and my boots, and I went out into the 16-degree morning, and I crossed the yard and I sat down on the back step beside the largest living thing I had ever been close to, and I put my hand on the shoulder where the fur was longest, and I felt the breath moving in and out underneath my hand. Slow. Labored. Real. I sat there for 2 full hours while the morning came in cold and white around us, and Samuel stood at the yard's edge and watched, and the 3 of us were in that arrangement together until the cold drove me back inside. What followed were 9 days. 9 days that I have measured and considered and lived inside my memory many times since, and I still do not have adequate language for them, so I will give you what I have and ask you to fill in what the words cannot carry. Goliath did not leave the yard. Samuel did not leave Goliath. I did not leave the house except to go out to them. I moved a heavy tarp from the equipment shed and rigged it between the back step post and the corner of the fence to cut the northwest wind, which was a gesture more than an effective solution, but gesture was the material I had to work with. Each morning, I went out and sat on the back step beside Goliath for as long as I could physically endure the cold. Each evening, I watched from the kitchen window as Samuel maintained the attendance, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing with one hand, and I will call it a hand, resting on Goliath's back, sometimes lying with a shoulder pressed against Goliath's side, always present, always immediate, never more than an arm's reach away from the moment. On the 3rd day, Goliath looked at me, directly, with the full and clear investment of both eyes, no ambiguity in the attention. I held it. I said the only thing I could think of that was both honest and complete, which was, I know. We held the moment for another few seconds, and then Goliath looked away toward the tree line, toward the north woods where they had always sheltered, and I went back inside and stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the windowsill and the stone and the feather, and did not move for a long time. On the 6th day, Samuel did something I must report because it is the center of the whole story, and everything else exists around it. In the late afternoon, with the light going orange and flat across the snow, I watched from the kitchen window as Samuel reached to the back step where I had placed both of the creek stones weeks earlier, when I had understood that the time was approaching and had brought them outside without being able to tell you exactly why. Samuel picked up the larger and darker of the 2 stones and held it for a moment with a quality I can only describe as consideration, then reached out and set it on Goliath's chest, in the center of the lighter fur there, where it rested with a weight I could feel from 20 feet away. The way you place a hand on someone you love who is leaving. The way you make yourself materially present because the words do not exist. The stone sat there. I did not go out. There was nothing I could add to what was already there. On the morning of the 9th day, Tuesday, the 28th of December, 2021, I went out at first light into a cold so clean and absolute it felt structural, and Goliath was still. The kind of stillness that carries no ambiguity and requires no confirmation, and lands in the body of the person witnessing it before the mind has processed anything. Samuel was lying against Goliath's side with the stillness of an entirely different quality, the stillness of grief in the body of a living thing, which any person who has ever sat beside the newly dead will recognize the instant they see it, because it has its own specific weight and temperature and way of occupying space. I stood in the cold yard for a long time. I said, "You were here. That matters. I do not know what to do with how much it matters, but it does." Then I went back inside. Samuel stayed for 3 more days without moving, without eating, lying against that side until the cold had done what cold does. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel was gone. No warning, no transition I witnessed, just gone, and the yard's edge empty in the early light, and the pressed and flattened place in the frozen grass where Goliath had lain for 9 days, and where Samuel had stayed for 12. And that was all that remained of it that I could see. I went out and stood in the center of that space and looked at the north tree line for a long time. It was just a tree line, pines and bare hardwoods and the gray winter sky behind them. But I stood there until I was certain I had looked at it long enough to have done the looking justice. Then I went back to the house. I buried the larger creek stone in the south orchard under the oldest of the apple trees in the spring, when the ground finally allowed it, late March, in a hole I dug with a spade on a morning that was cold but no longer brutal. I did not read anything or say anything. I set the stone in the ground and filled the hole and tamped it flat with the back of the spade, and stood there for a minute in the thin spring light with the bare branches of the apple tree above me. The thing existed. The bond existed. The loss existed. The ground holds all three of those facts with more permanence than I can offer them, and that will have to be enough. I want to tell you what that morning actually felt like, because I have been describing facts for a long time, and the facts are true, but they are not the whole of it. The orchard was still fully dormant in late March, the apple trees showing no leaf yet, only the gray-brown of the bark and the tight-closed fists of the buds not yet decided about opening. The ground had been frozen since November, and the top 6 inches of it still had a resistance that made the spade work hard. I dug the hole to about 18 inches, which took longer than it should have because I stopped several times to straighten my back and because I was not in any particular hurry. I was 63 years old, and post-surgery and the cold made my chest feel tight in a way that was probably nothing and possibly something, and I had learned to move more carefully through the world than I once had. The hole was approximately 12 inches across, wider than it needed to be for the stone, because I had not been thinking about efficiency when I dug it. I had been thinking about Goliath. About the first time I saw Goliath in the moonlight at the equipment shed corner, and how I had stood at the kitchen window with a rifle in my hands and set the rifle down. About every year of watching from that same window and what the watching had accumulated into. About the 9 days in December when the yard had been the whole world, and what happened in it had been the only thing that mattered. I set the stone in the center of the hole, and I looked at it for a moment, sitting there in the dark Tennessee clay. It was still the same stone Samuel had placed on Goliath's chest on the 6th day. I had brought it inside after and put it on the windowsill with the others, and it had sat there through January and February. I had picked it up most mornings without planning to, just found it in my hand when I was standing at the window with my coffee, turning it over, the way you turn something over when you are thinking about something else entirely, and your hands find the thing that is closest to the truth of what you are thinking. In March, I carried it out to the orchard and dug the hole. I did not plan that either. I woke up one morning and knew it was time, and went and got the spade. There are decisions that are not really decisions, just the body arriving at a conclusion the mind had been approaching for weeks without acknowledging it. I filled the hole and tamped it flat, and stood with the spade handle in both hands, and looked at the tree above me. The oldest of the apple trees was the one I had planted in the spring of 2013 from bare rootstock, a variety called winesap that the man at the nursery had recommended for this elevation and this kind of cold. It had given its first real harvest in 2016, maybe 60 pounds of deep red fruit that I had eaten and cooked and given away to my niece when she came out in October. It was 9 years old in the spring I buried the stone under it, and it had the look that young fruit trees get when they have been through enough winters to stop being uncertain about whether they are going to survive and start putting their energy into something other than mere continuation. I liked that tree. I had always felt some particular thing about that tree that I had not felt about the others. Some quality of attention I gave it when I walked the orchard rows that was slightly different from the attention I gave the rest. Standing over the filled hole under it in that cold March morning, I understood that the tree was already part of the same category of thing in my mind as the feather and the stone in the 9 days in December. The category of things that anchored the years to something real and lasting, and beyond my own interior accounting of them. The feather is still on the kitchen windowsill. I have not moved it in 14 years. It has become more fragile with each winter. two of the barbs broken now where the spine has dried and contracted through years of the kitchen's seasonal changes, warm and humid through the canning months and dry and cold in the deep winter. And the spine has expressed all of that in the way old organic things express the weather they have lived through. The deep, dark color along the spine has faded to something closer to charcoal. The light edges at the tips are nearly translucent now, worn thin by time rather than by handling because I have handled it very little. I know its exact location on the windowsill without looking. I know the angle it rests at and the way the morning light hits it differently in June than in December because of the sun's position, and I know exactly how much of it I can see from my chair at the kitchen table. I look at it most mornings while the coffee percolates. The smaller creek stone sits beside it, the original one that Samuel left on the back step in August of 2012, smooth and flat and the color of river mud dried to something more permanent. The two objects together, feather and stone, constitute the whole of what I have to show for 10 years of the most significant relationship of my adult life, and I have made my peace with that being both everything and not enough. And on different mornings those two assessments trade places in terms of which one is heavier. There are mornings when everything feels contained and sufficient, when the feather and the stone are simply two objects on a windowsill in a farmhouse in Tennessee, and the morning is ordinary, and my coffee is hot, and the light through the window is whatever the weather has made of it, and the farm is quiet in the way. It is quiet on mornings without wind. Those mornings, I feel a kind of settled rightness about the whole of it, the years and the loss and the arrangement, as though the shape of the thing is visible from a sufficient distance, and the shape makes a kind of sense that does not require explanation. And there are other mornings, 3 in the mornings, with my chest feeling the way it has been feeling lately, when the feather and the stone are exactly what they are, which is the entire physical evidence of something immense and irreplaceable, and the immensity sits on the chest alongside whatever else is sitting on the chest those mornings, and the combination is considerable. I have not seen Samuel since the morning I found the yard empty, 4 days after Goliath passed. 3 years and some months. I have looked. Not actively, not with the rifle and the flashlight of the early years, but with the looking that becomes habitual when you have trained yourself over a decade to read the tree line and the field edge and the quality of the dark at the back of the equipment shed. I have not seen Samuel. What I have seen, twice in the past 2 years, are tracks on the north side of the property near where the ridgeline breaks. Wide. Heavy. The stride not quite right for any named thing. I measured one set last February in the fresh snow, and the stride came out at 5 feet 8 inches between prints, which is shorter than Goliath's 6 feet, but longer than anything else I can account for. I stood in one of the prints with my size 11 boot, and there was room on all sides. I did not follow the tracks. I stood with them for a few minutes, and then walked back to the house. I do not know what to make of those tracks. I have tried on several different interpretations, and none of them fit cleanly. Samuel returning to the property after years away is the one I return to most often in the small hours, not because it is the most comfortable interpretation, but because it is the one that corresponds most closely to what I observed across a decade about how Samuel understood this farm and its relationship to whatever life the Samuel was living beyond its boundaries. This was not just territory to Samuel. It was something more specific than that. Something that had been chosen and returned to across years in a way that territory alone does not explain. If Samuel is still in these hills, still moving through the north woods above the ridgeline, then returning to this property at intervals seems consistent with everything I understood about Samuel's nature. That is, as far as I will take it. I will not dress it in more certainty than I actually have. I think about Samuel at the end when I am up at 3 in the morning with my chest feeling the way it feels lately, which is to say with an awareness of itself that it did not used to have. a kind of insistent self-announcement that bodies make when they are entering the phase of requiring more attention than they used to require. I think about what it means that a creature with no shared language, no social contract, no mutual history, assembled from spoken words or signed agreements, or the thousand other mechanisms that people use to formalize their obligations to each other, arrived at a dying companion's side and simply stayed. Stayed without being asked. Stayed without any framework of reciprocal obligation or expected return. Stayed because staying was what the moment required, and the moment was recognized for what it was, and that recognition was sufficient reason to remain. No more justification than that. No negotiation about what staying would cost or what it would give. Just the immediate and complete response to an immediate and complete need. I have known men who could not manage that. Good men, capable men, men I would have trusted my life to in a combat situation, who fell apart completely when the thing required of them was not action, but simple sustained presence, who needed to be doing something, fixing something, moving toward a solution, because the alternative, which was to sit beside the unfixable thing and simply remain in its presence without any agenda beyond the remaining, was more than their particular construction could hold. I understand that failure. I have lived it. I have been the man who left rooms that required staying in. I have been the man who found reasons to be elsewhere when the elsewhere was an avoidance, and I knew it was an avoidance and went anyway. The surgery was not the first time I chose departure over presence, and I will not inventory the other times here because the inventory is long and some of it involves people who deserved better, and the accounting of it is mine to carry and not yours to be burdened with. I will say only that the 12 days in the December yard gave me a standard to measure myself against that I had not previously had access to, and the measuring has been both instructive and, in its way, corrective. What Samuel did across those 12 days, those 9 days of Goliath's dying and the 3 days after, was not complicated. It was the simplest possible thing. It was presence without agenda, attendance without expectation, companionship stripped of every element except the core fact of being there. There was no comfort Samuel could offer that would change the outcome. There was no action that would alter what was happening or slow its progression. Samuel knew this in whatever way Samuel knew things, which was not in the way I know things, but was clearly in some operative way real and accurate and complete. And knowing it, knowing that nothing could be done, and that the loss was coming regardless of what was offered, Samuel stayed anyway. Stayed closer. Set the stone on the chest and stayed. Lay against the side through the cold nights and stayed. That is the whole of what Samuel did, and it is also, I have come to believe, the whole of what love requires when all the other requirements have been exhausted, when fixing is not available, when comfort is insufficient, when language has nothing left to add. What remains is the body in the same space as the other body, the warmth of it and the weight of it, and the simple, undeniable material fact of its continued presence saying the only thing that can still be said, which is, I am here. I am still here. I will be here when the last of it passes through, and I will be here in the quiet after, and you will not have done this alone. I have had 67 years, and I have done a great many things with them. I served 22 years, and I was good at what I asked of myself in that service, and I carry the weight of some of it, and the pride of other parts of it, and the complicated mixture of both in the middle where most of it lives. I built this farm from a neglected property into something that functions and is cared for and will outlast me, which is its own kind of accomplishment. I have been a poor husband, and I have been an honest friend to the few people I have allowed close enough to need honesty from me, and those two facts coexist without resolution. I have learned this land in the way I said earlier, which is the only real way to learn it, and that learning has been one of the abiding satisfactions of my life. But when I sit with the whole of the 67 years and ask which part of it I would choose to be remembered by if I had to choose, it is not the service and it is not the farm, and it is not any of the things I built or fixed or survived. It is 12 days in a December yard. It is a hand placed on a shoulder in 16-degree cold. It is a creek stone set on a chest. It is the understanding, arrived at late but arrived at completely, that witness is not a lesser form of love. It is, in the circumstances where nothing else remains, the highest form of it. Goliath never asked me to understand what Goliath was. Samuel never needed me to explain what I was either. We were 3 creatures sharing 43 acres for 10 years, and what grew between us in that time grew the way things grow in this kind of land. Slowly, without announcement, taking root in the dark before anything was visible at the surface, and by the time I could see it clearly, it had already been there long enough to be permanent. All I did was stay close enough and long enough to see what happened between them, and the staying and the seeing were the only things ever asked of me, and they were sufficient, and they were the most important things I have ever done with my time on this earth. I have had 67 years to do things with, and I am at peace with that accounting. The feather on the windowsill says what it has always said. The stone beside it says the same. Some mornings, in the light that comes through the kitchen window at the particular angle of late spring, they almost say it out loud.